4 riders came up the mountain to take her. The sheriff had a badge, the rancher had a contract, and 2 armed men had orders to drag her back to a town that never wanted her in the first place. She had no lawyer, no family, no way out. Then the biggest man she had ever known stepped forward, leveled his rifle, and said 5 words that changed everything. "I will marry her." This is the story of how a woman with nothing found everything on a mountain nobody else dared climb. The letter said he needed a wife. It did not say he lived on a mountain no wagon could reach. It did not say he had not spoken to another living soul in 3 years. And it sure as hell did not say he would be the most terrifying and the most gentle man she had ever met. But before she met him, she had to survive the town. Before we go on, if you are new here, hit subscribe. I share new frontier stories every week. And drop a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight. I would love to know how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back to the summer of 1878, to a dusty road in Wyoming territory, to the moment everything began. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Copper Ridge Hotel on a blistering afternoon in late June, sending up a cloud of red dust that settled over Clara Whitfield like a veil made of disappointment. The driver hauled on the brake with a grunt, and the horses stood blowing and stamping in the heat, their coats dark with sweat. Clara climbed down carefully. She was 23 years old, and everything she owned in the world fit inside the worn carpet bag that the driver tossed into the dirt at her feet without ceremony. It landed with a hollow thud. Everything Clara had, and it barely made a sound. She stood there for a moment, smoothing the front of her navy blue traveling dress with hands that trembled only slightly. The dress had been elegant once. 3 weeks on a stagecoach had changed that. The fabric was stiff with trail dust. The lace at the collar had yellowed. The hem was frayed where it had caught on the coach steps somewhere in Nebraska. But it was the only dress she owned, and she wore it the way a soldier wears armor, with pride and with the full knowledge that it might not be enough. At her throat, pinned to the high collar, sat a small cameo brooch, ivory profile on a pale blue background. It had been her mother's mother's before that. It was the last piece of the life Clara had lost, and she touched it now the way a drowning woman touches solid ground, just to make sure it was real, just to make sure she was real. Copper Ridge, Wyoming territory. 300 souls carved out a wilderness at the base of the Blackwood Mountains. She could see the whole town from where she stood. A single dirt road rutted and baked hard by the summer sun, lined with false-fronted buildings that looked like they were holding their breath. A general store, a hotel, a saloon already doing steady business despite the early hour. A church at the far end of the street, its white paint peeling its steeple, leaning slightly to the east, as though even God's house was tired of standing up straight in this place. Mountains rose in every direction, blue and massive and indifferent, snow-capped, and even in June, their peaks cutting into a sky so bright it hurt to look at. Beautiful country, hard country, the kind of country that did not care whether you survived it. Clara picked up her carpet bag and looked for the man who was supposed to be her future. She found him. Or rather, he found her and did not move. Randall Crane stood on the porch of the Copper Ridge Hotel with his arms folded across a vest that strained at the buttons. He was 48 years old, thick through the middle, with the ruddy complexion of a man who ate well and worked little. His suit was expensive, too expensive for a frontier porch. It looked like something you would see in a Boston drawing room, not a Wyoming cattle town, and the contrast made him look foolish in a way Clara suspected he did not realize. Beside him stood a woman Clara would come to know as Mrs. Priscilla Hadley, tall, thin, dressed in silk that had no business being this far from a railroad, with a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than wood. She leaned toward Crane and whispered something behind her gloved hand. Her eyes never left Clara. The smile on her lips had nothing to do with kindness. Clara squared her shoulders. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the hotel porch with her chin lifted and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "Mr. Crane," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "I am Clara Whitfield, your bride." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Clara had ever heard. Crane's eyes moved over her with the slow, cold assessment of a man examining livestock at auction. His gaze started at her dusty shoes, traveled up her road-worn dress, paused at the carpet bag that clearly contained everything she owned, and finally arrived at her face. His expression did not change. It did not need to. The verdict was already written in the thin line of his mouth. "You are the Whitfield girl," he said. Not a question, not a greeting, a statement of inventory delivered with the enthusiasm of a man who has opened a crate and found the wrong merchandise inside. "Yes, sir. I wrote to you about my circumstances. I told you everything in my letters. I was completely honest. I know what you wrote." Crane unfolded his arms and placed his hands on the porch railing, leaning forward slightly so his voice would carry. He was not trying to be private about this. Clara would understand that later. The humiliation was the point. Your letters were acceptable. But letters do not tell the whole story, do they? Something cold began to crawl up Clara's spine. "I was truthful in everything I wrote, Mr. Crane. I told you I had no family, no dowry, no connections. I told you my mother had passed and I was alone in the world. No money." Crane ticked off each word like items on a bill of sale. No connections, no dowry, no family name worth mentioning. "I was willing to overlook all of that, Miss Whitfield, because I assumed that a woman desperate enough to answer a matrimonial advertisement in a newspaper would at least bring some practical value to the arrangement." The words hit Clara like stones thrown by someone who had practiced their aim. She felt heat rush to her cheeks. She felt the eyes of every person on Main Street turning toward her, drawn by the spectacle of a woman being publicly weighed and found wanting. "I can work hard," she said quietly, the first time she would say those words in Copper Ridge. Not the last. "I am educated. I can keep accounts, manage a household. I cook and sew, and I am not afraid of labor." Any woman can do those things. Crane waved his hand as though swatting away a fly. "What I needed was a wife who would be an asset, someone with bearing, with connections that could help me build standing in this territory. What I see before me is a girl with nothing. No family, no resources, no prospects whatsoever." Mrs. Hadley stepped forward, then her voice dipped in honey that had gone rancid. "Oh, Mr. Crane, do not be too harsh. The poor thing has come all this way. Surely there is something she can do in town. Washing, perhaps, or some other form of domestic service." She let the suggestion hang in the air like smoke. Her meaning was clear and ugly. Clara's vision blurred. She blinked hard and fast and forced the tears back behind her eyes where no one could see them. She would not cry. She would not break. Not here, not in front of these people. She had survived worse than this. She had survived her mother dying by inches in a cold room in Boston, coughing blood into handkerchiefs that Clara washed and rewashed until the fabric wore through. She had survived the landlord who took their rooms 3 days after the funeral. She had survived the stagecoach journey west, 21 days of dust and bad food and strangers who pressed themselves against the walls to avoid touching her as though poverty were contagious. She could survive this. "The arrangement is off," Crane said flatly. He was already turning toward the hotel door. "Already done with her. I have made other plans. Mrs. Hadley's niece arrives from Philadelphia next month. Good family, proper connections." He paused, one hand on the door. "I suggest you find the next stage east and return wherever you came from. You'll find work here if anyone will have you. Good day, Miss Whitfield." The door closed behind him. Mrs. Hadley lingered. Of course she did. Women like Mrs. Hadley always lingered at the scene of someone else's ruin. She looked Clara over one last time, slowly, thoroughly, the way you might examine a piece of furniture you have decided not to buy. "Do not take it personally, dear." Her voice carried beautifully. She had practiced this. Every word, every pause, every cruel syllable was a performance for the gathering crowd. Copper Ridge has standards, even for mail-order brides. And some women simply do not measure up. She turned and followed Crane inside, and the door closed, and Clara Whitfield stood alone on the boardwalk of a town she had never seen before today, holding a carpet bag that contained everything she owned, wearing a dress that was falling apart with $4 to her name, and no place on earth where she was wanted. The townspeople began to drift away. Some looked at her with pity. Most looked at her with the squirming discomfort of people who have witnessed something shameful and want to forget it as quickly as possible. No one spoke to her. No one offered help. No one stepped forward. Clara stood there for a long moment. Then she touched the cameo at her throat, the smooth ivory warm under her fingers, and she whispered something her mother used to say. I can work hard. I am strong. Then she picked up her bag and started walking, because standing still felt like dying. The next 4 days in Copper Ridge taught Clara Whitfield exactly how quickly a human being can go from invisible to untouchable. She tried the hotel first. The manager, a wiry man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, looked at her over the top of his ledger and said the position had been filled. He did not look up again. She tried the restaurant. The owner said he was not hiring. He said it while looking past her at the street as though she had already left. She tried the seamstress. Mrs. Wright examined Clara's needlework with genuine interest. She held the sample up to the window light and turned it in her fingers, studying the stitches, the tension, the invisible evenness of the hemwork. Your stitches are finer than mine, she admitted. Where did you learn? Clara told her about her mother, about the years of sewing by candlelight in their tiny Boston apartment, mending other people's clothes for pennies that barely covered thread, about the way her mother had insisted Clara learn to make every stitch perfect because she said knowledge is the one thing nobody can take from you. For a moment, Clara saw possibility in Mrs. Wright's eyes, something close to yes. Then the seamstress glanced toward the front window, toward Main Street, toward the social order that governed every transaction in this town. Her expression closed like a gate swinging shut. I am sorry, Miss Whitfield. I truly am. But if Mrs. Hadley were to see you working here, she let the sentence die. She did not need to finish it. In Copper Ridge, Mrs. Hadley's disapproval was a death sentence for any business that depended on female customers, which meant every business. Clara tried the boarding house next, a sagging two-story structure run by a woman named Dolly Sims. Dolly had a weathered face, a pipe clenched between her teeth, and the direct gaze of someone who had stopped pretending about anything a long time ago. $2 a week, Dolly said. In advance, no meals. Outhouse out back. You cause trouble, you are gone. Clara counted out the coins from her small purse, watching her safety dwindle to almost nothing. The room was smaller than a closet. A narrow bed with a mattress so thin she could feel the wooden slats through it. A washstand with a chipped basin. A chair with one leg shorter than the others that rocked unevenly when she set her carpet bag on it. Water stains bloomed on the ceiling like grotesque flowers. Through the thin walls, she could hear voices, laughter, the sounds of other lives being lived. Clara sat on the bed. It groaned but held. She allowed herself exactly 1 minute of despair. 60 seconds with her face in her hands and her shoulders shaking. Then she straightened her spine, wiped her eyes, and began planning. Because giving up was not something Clara Whitfield knew how to do. The second day was worse. She washed dishes at the restaurant for 12 hours straight, standing at a trough of scalding water behind the kitchen, her hands cracking and bleeding from the lye soap, scrubbing plates and pots, while the cook ignored her and the waitresses gossiped about Crane's cast-off just loud enough for Clara to hear. She earned 30 cents. She hauled water for the livery stable. The stable master agreed but paid her only a dime for a full day of carrying buckets that weighed as much as she did. Then he told her not to come back because having a woman doing man's work looked bad, especially one that folks were talking about. The third day, Clara found Mrs. Brewer, an Irish widow who ran a laundry operation by the creek. 2 small children played nearby building forts from sticks and pebbles. Mrs. Brewer's hands were red and raw from the washboard, her back permanently curved from years of bending over the steaming tubs. She looked up when Clara approached, and the weariness in her eyes was bone deep. I am looking for work, Clara said. I can wash, I can iron, I can carry heavy loads. Mrs. Brewer shook her head slowly. No work, dear, barely enough to feed my own. She studied Clara with the frank sympathy of one struggling woman recognizing another. She reached into her apron pocket and pressed a piece of warm cornbread into Clara's hand. God keep you, child, she said in her thick Irish brogue. Clara thanked her and walked away before Mrs. Brewer could see her face crumble. She understood the difference now, between rejection born of cruelty and rejection born of poverty. Both hurt, but only one was evil. The fourth day, a man approached her on a bench near the general store, well-dressed, smooth-voiced, a smile that did not reach his eyes. He said he ran an establishment 5 miles south of town, room and board included. Good money for a woman willing to work hard. Clara understood immediately what kind of establishment he meant. What kind of work? No, she said firmly. Thank you, but no. The man's smile cooled. Suit yourself, but you might want to reconsider. Not many options for a woman in your situation. His gaze dropped to her body, then back to her face with a familiarity that made Clara's skin crawl. Though I will be honest, some men prefer a woman with a bit of refinement. You might do well enough. I said no. He shrugged. Your funeral. Or starvation, more like. He tipped in his hat with mocking haughty courtesy and walked away, leaving Clara Bierk alone on the bench, with her hands shaking and the taste of bile in her throat. That was what it had come to. A brothel owner sizing her up as viable merchandise. Not valuable, just viable. Clara sat on that bench as the afternoon shadows lengthened, watching Copper Ridge move around her as though she were made of glass. Women in their fine dresses crossing the street. Men conducting business, shaking hands, making deals. Children chasing each other, their laughter sharp as breaking glass. All of it happening around her. None of it including her. She did not know that 2 blocks away, a barefoot 12-year-old boy with freckles and curious eyes was hearing a conversation that would change her life forever. Tommy Finch found her just before sunset. He appeared in front of the bench like something conjured from dust and sunlight. 12 years old, skinny as a fence rail, barefoot, despite the rough ground, with a patched shirt 3 sizes too big, and eyes that missed nothing. You are the bride Crane would not have, he said, not cruelly, just with the unfiltered honesty of a child who has not yet learned to coat truth in manners. I am Clara, said carefully. Are you really looking for work, any kind? As long as it is honest, any kind. As long as it is honest. Tommy's face broke into a grin wide enough to show a missing tooth. Then you might be in luck. He dropped his voice to a dramatic whisper. You know about the Blackwood brothers? Clara shook her head. 3 men. Tommy set his eyes bright with the pleasure of sharing something dangerous. They live up in the mountains. Way up. A cabin nobody can find unless they know the trail. They call them the Blackwood Devils. My pa says Silas Blackwood killed a man in Montana. My ma says all 3 of them are half wild, living up there like animals without a woman's civilizing influence. He paused for effect. But here's the thing. Mr. Patterson, the man who runs a small general store down by the mill, he has been trying for months to find somebody willing to haul supplies up to that cabin. Nobody will do it. The trail is too steep, too dangerous, and the Blackwood brothers are too scary, but they pay well, real well. Tommy leaned closer. $5 for a single delivery run. Clara felt her whole body go still. $5, more than a week's rent at the boarding house, more than she had earned in the past 4 days combined. $5 was not just money. $5 was survival. Where is this store? Clara asked. Tommy's grin widened. I will show you. Come on. Emmett Patterson's general store was smaller than the main mercantile, tucked between the sawmill and a warehouse that smelled of fresh-cut timber and something vaguely sweet. But the proprietor was a round man with kind eyes and a magnificent mustache who looked up when Tommy led Clara through the door and actually smiled. It was the first genuine smile Clara had seen in Copper Ridge. Patterson listened to Clara's situation with the practical sympathy of a man who understood hardship without being defeated by it. He did not ask why Crane had rejected her. He did not comment on her dust-covered dress or her thin shoes or the desperation she could not quite hide behind her careful composure. He simply laid out the facts. The trail is steep, he said, narrow, dangerous in places. There is a stretch above the second switchback where the path is barely wide enough for a horse with a drop of 200 feet to the creek below. Loose rock after rain. Mountain lions bold as brass this time of year. He paused, watching her face. She did not flinch. The Blackwood brothers, he continued. 3 men, 3 brothers. Came to Wyoming from Montana 4 years ago. Built a homestead up in the high country. They rarely come to town. When they do, people get out of their way. He stroked his mustache thoughtfully. Silas, the eldest, he is the one folks are most afraid of. Does not talk. Barely looks at anyone. Built like the mountain itself. Elijah, the middle one, he is the dangerous one, truthfully. Hot temper like a short fuse on black powder. Got into a fight at the saloon last winter and nearly put a man through a wall. And Gideon, the youngest, he is the gentlest of the three, usually the one who comes down for supplies. But he broke his leg last month. Horse threw him on the high trail. That is why the supplies have been stacking up. Patterson opened a drawer and pulled out a hand-drawn map on brown paper. He traced the trail with his finger, marking the switchbacks, the creek crossings, the places where the blazes on the trees would guide her. $5 when you get back, he said. I will pack the supplies on a mule. You can ride my mare Penny. She is sure-footed, which is what matters on that trail. When do I leave first light tomorrow? Patterson extended his hand across the counter. His grip was firm, his palm calloused, his eyes steady. You sure about this, Miss Whitfield? Clara shook his hand. She had to look up to meet his gaze. He was a tall man and she was not. But in that moment, she felt taller than she had in weeks. I am sure, she said, because what choice did she have? That evening, Clara spent her last 30 cents on a loaf of bread and a small piece of cheese. She ate half and wrapped the rest in a handkerchief for the morning. Then she lay on the narrow bed in the boarding house, staring at the ceiling, and tried not to think about what tomorrow would bring. A dangerous trail through mountain wilderness. 3 reclusive brothers with violent reputations. The possibility of getting lost, getting hurt, getting killed. But also $5, maybe more. Enough to buy herself time. Enough to buy herself hope. She pinned her mother's cameo over her heart and closed her eyes. Just let me be strong enough, she whispered to the darkness. Just let me survive this. Just let me find a way forward. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and snow from the mountains. From somewhere in the wilderness, a wolf howled, lonely and wild and free. Clara fell asleep wondering what it would be like to be any of those things. She woke before dawn. Patterson was waiting outside his store with 2 animals. Penny was a sturdy bay mare with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition. The mule was already loaded with supplies, canvas-wrapped bundles strapped to the pack saddle with the balanced precision of a man who had done this many times before. Flour on one side, coffee, and tobacco on the other, ammunition secured separately in a leather pouch, salt and sugar sealed tight against moisture. Everything balanced perfectly. On a narrow mountain trail, a lopsided load could send a mule over the edge and take the rider with it. Patterson handed Clara a canteen and a small cloth bundle, water and jerky for the road. Then he said something that would stay with her for a long time. The Blackwoods are not what people say they are, Miss Whitfield. At least they are not only what people say. Just keep an open mind. The ride began innocently. The trail followed Copper Creek through stands of ponderosa pine and quaking aspen, the morning air cool and sweet, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. Wildflowers bordered the path in colorful profusion. Purple lupine, yellow arrowleaf balsam root, clusters of white yarrow swaying in a breeze that smelled like clean water and growing things. Penny moved confidently, her hooves crunching on gravel and pine needles. The mule followed placidly behind, unconcerned by anything except the occasional patch of grass worth investigating. But as the elevation increased, everything changed. The creek narrowed to a rushing torrent, tumbling over boulders in white cascades that filled the air with mist and the constant roar of falling water. The path grew steeper. Clara could feel Penny's muscles bunch beneath her as the horse picked her way over exposed roots and loose stones. The trees pressed closer, blocking the sun, creating a green twilight that was beautiful and disorienting all at once. Then the trees thinned, and the trail stepped out onto the first of several exposed switchbacks. Clara's stomach dropped straight into her boots. The mountainside rose sheer on her right, raw rock and scrubby growth reaching toward a sky that seemed impossibly far away. And on her left, the world simply fell away. Hundreds of feet of empty air down to a canyon floor where the creek was just a thin silver ribbon, winding through trees that looked like moss from this height. One misstep. That was all it would take. One stumble, one moment of carelessness, and Clara and Penny and the mule and $5 worth of supplies would tumble into that beautiful, merciless void. Clara gripped the reins so hard her knuckles went white. Her breathing turned shallow. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to turn around, to go back to Copper Ridge and take her chances with the town's cruelty rather than risk her life on this ribbon of dirt carved into the side of a mountain. But she did not turn around. Good girl, she whispered to the mare, her voice tight with fear but steady enough to mean something. Nice and easy, just keep going, one step at a time. Penny's ears flicked back at the sound. The horse settled slightly as though the words provided mutual reassurance. Together they eased along the narrow ledge, the mule following behind with the supreme indifference of an animal that had never considered the possibility of failure. They climbed higher. Clara's dress clung to her back with sweat despite the cool mountain air. Her stomach growled. She had eaten the last of her bread at dawn, too anxious to save it. Her legs ached from gripping the saddle, her hands cramped from holding the reins. Time lost meaning. There was only the trail and the next step in the mountain that went on and on and on. She passed through a grove of aspens, where the white trunks glowed like cathedral candles in the dampled light, their leaves whispering in a language she could not understand but found oddly comforting. A hawk circled overhead, riding invisible currents of warm air above the peaks. Clara watched it with a mixture of envy and wonder. To be that free, to be that unafraid of height and distance in the vast, indifferent sky. Then the trail leveled out onto a high mountain meadow, and Clara saw the cabin. It sat at the far edge of the clearing, backed against a wall of rock and old-growth timber. It was larger than she had expected, solidly built from logs chinked with moss and mud, with a stone chimney that rose straight and true, and a porch that ran the full length of the front. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin gray line. A wood pile was stacked against one wall, each log cut evenly, each piece placed with near military precision, the stack taller than Clara by a good 2 feet. A barn, a stable, a corral holding several horses, a garden plot weedy and struggling, but clearly someone's attempt. On the porch, she could see tools hung from hooks in careful order. A felling axe with a birch handle worn smooth from years of use. A coil of rope drying in the sun. Iron traps hanging from nails. A shovel, a pick, a leather saddlebag, dark with age and oil. This was not the lair of savages. This was the homestead of men who understood that survival in the mountains depended on keeping your tools sharp and your supplies organized. Men who worked with their hands and took pride in what those hands built. Clara's relief was so intense she felt dizzy. She had made it, against her own doubts and the town's expectations, in a trail that had tried its best to kill her. She had actually made it. She dismounted awkwardly, her legs nearly buckling, when her feet hit the ground. She tied both animals to the porch rail and stood for a moment, smoothing her dress, composing herself. Then she climbed the 2 wooden steps and knocked. Silence. She knocked again, louder. "Mr. Blackwood, I have your supplies from Patterson's store." The door opened. He was not what she expected. He was younger than she had imagined, maybe 28, with dark blonde hair and warm hazel eyes that widened with genuine surprise when he saw her. A broken leg, splinted and wrapped, was propped on a stool just inside the door. Even seated, he was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of frame that suggested significant physical power even when it was resting. Gideon Blackwood looked at Clara, and then he looked past her at the animals tied to the rail, and then he looked at her again. "Patterson sent you," he said. "He said you needed supplies delivered." "We do, but—" He stopped himself. Started again. "You came up that trail alone." Clara lifted her chin. Just slightly, a gesture that was becoming her signature. Defiance wrapped in quiet dignity. Gideon's face broke into a slow, wide smile. The warmth of it was so unexpected, so genuine, that Clara felt something loosen in her chest, something she had been holding tight since Boston. "Well," he said. "Well, come in. Please, Silas and Elijah are out checking the trap lines. They will be back before dark." He offered her coffee. Clara nearly wept at the simple kindness of it. He apologized for the state of the cabin. 3 men without a woman's touch, he said with a rueful glance at the clutter. Books everywhere, traps and tools hung from hooks. The smell of coffee and leather and wood smoke, and something indefinable that Clara would later recognize as the scent of solitude. Gideon talked while she drank her coffee. He told her about the homestead, 640 acres of mountain land, a timber claim, good hunting, a small herd of cattle pastured in the lower meadow. They had come to Wyoming from Montana 4 years before, he said. All 4 of them. Silas and Mary, his wife, along with Elijah and Gideon. They had built this cabin together, every log, every chink, every stone of the chimney. Then his voice dropped. His warm hazel eyes grew sad, and he told her about Mary. "Mary was his wife," Gideon said quietly. "1 year after we finished this cabin, she got with child. She died in childbirth. Right here. In the bed you can see behind that curtain. The baby died too. A boy. Silas rode through the night to fetch the doctor from town, but the doctor was drunk. Useless. By the time Silas got back with a midwife, it was too late. 3 years now. Silas, he almost did not survive the grief. He stopped eating, stopped speaking. Elijah and I stayed because we could not leave him alone up here. Clara set down her coffee cup. Did the mountains help him heal? Gideon considered the question carefully. The mountains gave him space, he said. Whether he has healed is a different question entirely. The sound of horses approaching cut the conversation short. Clara moved to the window and saw two riders emerging from the tree line at the edge of the meadow. Even from a distance, they were formidable. Two tall men on tall horses moving with the easy, unconscious confidence of people who were entirely at home in wild country. The door opened. Silas Blackwood walked into the cabin, and Clara's first thought was that the doorframe was not built for a man this size. He was 6 feet 6 inches of hard-packed muscle and controlled movement shoulders so broad he had to angle slightly to get through. Dark chestnut, brown hair wind-tangled falling past his collar. A scar across his left eyebrow, old and white. And eyes the color of aged whiskey, pale amber shot through with gold, that moved over Clara with an expression she could not read. Not hostile, not welcoming, just assessing, calculating. The way a mountain lion evaluates something new in its territory. Behind him came Elijah. Auburn-haired, lean, but corded with muscle, moving with a dangerous grace that reminded Clara of a coiled spring. His whiskey-brown eyes flashed between Clara and Gideon with immediate suspicion. "Who is this?" Elijah said. Not to Clara, to Gideon, as if she were not worth addressing directly. "This is Miss Clara Whitfield," Gideon said firmly. "Patterson sent her up with the supplies. She rode that trail alone, Eli." Elijah's eyebrows rose. He looked at Clara again. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a grudging acknowledgement that what she had done took guts. Silas said nothing. He moved past Clara without a word, went straight to the supply packs and began unloading with quick, efficient movements. Flour and coffee, tobacco and ammunition, salt and sugar, and a bolt of canvas. Everything was examined briefly, then carried inside or stored in the lean-to shelter by the barn. Clara stood watching, unsure whether she should help or stay out of the way. After several minutes of silence, Silas spoke without looking at her. His voice was low and rough, as if his vocal cords had rusted from disuse. "You rode up alone." "Yes, sir. Long ride for a woman," I managed fine. Silas's hands paused on a sack of flour. He turned his head, and for the first time, his amber eyes met her cornflower blue ones directly. Clara held the gaze. She did not look away. She would not look away. Something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of shared stubbornness, of shared refusal to be defeated by the world's low expectations. "You are the one," Crane would not have, Silas said. Not a question, not mockery, just a fact stated plainly, stripped of judgment. "I am. Crane is a fool." The statement was so flat, so stripped of sentiment, so utterly matter-of-fact that it took Clara a full 3 seconds to understand what had just happened. This mountain man, this silent, grieving stone-faced giant who terrified an entire town, had just defended her worth, not with flowery words or empty compliments, with 5 syllables of absolute conviction. Crane is a fool, meaning the man who rejected you was the one with poor judgment. Not you. "Thank you," Clara whispered, was not a compliment. Silas turned back to the supplies. Just a fact. Elijah, standing in the doorway, exchanged a glance with Gideon. The look that passed between the brothers held an entire conversation. Their brother, the man who sometimes went days without speaking more than 10 words, had just talked more to the strange woman in 5 minutes than he talked to them in a week. Something was happening, something none of them expected. Payment came with the same blunt efficiency that characterized everything about Silas. He counted 5 silver dollars into Clara's palm. The coins were heavy and cold and real. Then, as she was about to close her hand, he added 2 more. For making the ride, he said, and for not turning back when the trail got steep. $7, more money than Clara had held in months. She protested. "It was too much. I decide what is too much." His tone did not invite argument. Clara slept that night in the stable loft. Simple quarters, hay scattered over wooden planks, a few old blankets folded in one corner, a lantern hanging from a nail. Through a gap in the boards, she could see the meadow bathed in starlight, the mountains silver and black against the sky blazing with more stars than she had ever imagined existed. The air smelled of hay and horse and pine, and it was the sweetest air she had breathed since leaving Boston. Below through the stable floor, she could hear the brothers talking. Their voices were too low to make out words, but the tone told her something. Gideon's voice was warm and persuasive. Elijah's was sharp and skeptical. And Silas's was a low rumble, brief and final. Whatever decision was being made, Silas made it. In the morning, before Clara could saddle Penny and ride back down, Silas was waiting on the porch, coffee in his massive hand, face unreadable as stone. Gideon cannot work with that leg, he said without preamble. Will not be healed for weeks. Elijah and I need to run trap lines, tend the cattle handle, everything Gideon usually does on top of our own work. We need help, he paused. Took a slow sip of coffee. I am offering you a position, cook, housekeeper, tend the garden. Gideon has let it go to ruin since he got hurt. Help with processing game, general work around the homestead, room and board included, plus $20 a month. Clara's breath caught. $20 a month. More than most hired men made. More than she had ever imagined earning. Before you answer, Silas continued, know what it means. You would be living here with 3 unmarried men. People in town will talk. They will say things about you that are not true, and there will be nothing you can do to stop it. People in town are already talking about me, Clara said quietly, and none of it is true either. Something flickered in Silas's eyes, the faintest ghost of what might have been approval. Gideon spoke from inside the cabin, his voice carrying through the open door. You would have your own space, the sleeping alcove off the main room. We will build a proper wall and door, real privacy. Elijah appeared in the doorway, arms folded, expression unreadable. But when he spoke, his words carried the weight of a blood oath. Rule 4, he said, nobody touches you. Nobody, not us, not anyone. You are under our protection, and that means something. The words were fierce, almost aggressive, but Clara heard the promise beneath them. She looked from Elijah to Gideon to Silas. 3 men, 3 brothers, offering her what no one else in Wyoming territory had offered. A place, a purpose, safety. I accept, Clara said. When do I start? You already have, Gideon called out with a grin she could hear even without seeing. That coffee you are drinking, you made it better than Silas has in 3 years, and you have not even tried yet. Something happened then that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. Silas Blackwood's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the ghost of one. The memory of what smiling felt like surfacing for just a moment before sinking back beneath the ice. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Clara rode down to Copper Ridge to collect her belongings. She returned Penny and the mule to Patterson, who was overjoyed that the delivery had gone well. When she told him about the position, his expression grew complicated. Concern and relief and something like admiration all tangled together. The Blackwood brothers, he said slowly, all 3 of them. It is honest work, Mr. Patterson, I do not doubt that. But this town will not see it that way. This town rejected me before I ever set foot in that cabin. They do not get to decide my future. Patterson studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. You remind me of my late wife, he said quietly. She had that same steel in her spine. Clara packed her carpet bag at the boarding house. She paid her final night. She walked through the streets of Copper Ridge for the last time with her head high and her eyes forward. On the boardwalk outside the millinery shop, she met Mrs. Hadley. The woman's eyes widened with something that was not quite surprise and not quite delight, but lived in the ugly space between them. Leaving so soon, Mrs. Hadley called out loud enough for every person within 50 yards to hear. I heard you have found employment with the Blackwood Savages. How wonderfully resourceful of you. Clara stopped walking. She turned, and for the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge, she did not flinch. I found honest men who value hard work and treat people with decency. Clara said, her voice clear and strong and carrying farther than Mrs. Hadley's ever had. I understand those qualities might seem savage to someone like you. She turned and walked away before Mrs. Hadley could respond. Behind her, she heard the outraged gasp. The buzz of scandalized whispers spreading like wildfire through the watching crowd. Let them talk. Let them scandalize themselves. She was done caring what Copper Ridge thought of Clara Whitfield. The next morning, she rode up the mountain trail for the second time. Her carpet bag was strapped behind the saddle. Her mother's cameo was pinned over her heart. She did not look back at Copper Ridge. There was nothing behind her worth seeing. At the cabin, Gideon was waiting on the porch, broken leg, propped up a book in his hands, with a wide smile on his face. Elijah was in the corral, working with a half-wild Mustang, his movements fluid and fearless. And through the cabin window, Clara could see the silhouette of Silas moving in the firelight. She was home. She did not know it yet. But this mountain, these three brothers, this life that was nothing like anything she had planned or imagined or dared to hope for, it was going to change everything. But she did not know what was coming. None of them did. The hardest part was still ahead. And the mountain, ancient and patient and utterly indifferent to human suffering, was already watching. The first weeks at the Blackwood homestead settled into a rhythm that felt like learning a new language. Every day, Clara discovered something she did not know. And every day, she proved she could learn it. She rose before dawn, before even Silas, which startled the brothers because Silas had always been the first to wake. She started the coffee and the porridge and tended the fire, feeding it carefully the way Gideon showed her, banking the coals at night so the embers would catch fast in the cold mountain mornings. Then she went to the garden. The garden became her first real project. Gideon had tried to maintain it after breaking his leg, but he could not kneel, could not pull weeds, could not coax the struggling plants back from the edge of neglect. By the time Clara arrived, the weeds had conquered half the rows. The bean trellises had collapsed under their own weight. Something had been eating the squash, leaving ragged half-moons bitten into the leaves. The tomato plants drooped earthward like defeated soldiers. Clara spent hours on her knees in that mountain soil, pulling weeds with bare hands until her fingers bled, restaking the tomato plants with strips of cloth torn from her old petticoat, building a low fence from sticks and twine to keep the rabbits out of the squash. Her hands, already roughened from years of needlework and washing in Boston, grew harder. Blisters formed, burst, and reformed as calluses. Her skin, once porcelain, pale, took on the warm, golden tone of someone who lived under open sky. She was changing, becoming someone who belonged in this landscape, and the brothers noticed. Each of them related to Clara differently, and those differences told her everything she needed to know about who they really were. Gideon was the easiest. Confined to his chair with the broken leg, frustrated by his uselessness, he was grateful for company. Clara kept him talking while she worked in the cabin, and their friendship grew through conversation. He read aloud to her, Shakespeare and Dickens, and a battered copy of Whitman that he handled like scripture. Clara could match him in literary discussion, quoting passages from memory, debating interpretations, and Gideon's delight was so genuine, it made something warm bloom in Clara's chest. Nobody had treated her as an intellectual equal since her mother died. They developed a gentle running joke about Elijah's hatred of books. They argued about Hamlet. They talked about whether the frontier would produce its own great literature. Clara told him about her mother, about the woman who insisted her daughter learn to read and think, even as they slid deeper into poverty. Knowledge is the one thing nobody can take from you, Clara said quietly one afternoon. My mother was wrong about a lot of things, but she was right about that. Gideon smiled. Your mother sounds like she would have liked it up here. Elijah was the hardest. He tested Clara the way a horse tests a new rider. Not with cruelty, but with challenges designed to reveal whether she would break. He asked her to help haul firewood. She hauled it. He asked her to carry water from the spring 200 yards from the cabin using a shoulder yoke that distributed the weight of 2 full buckets across her back. She fell the first time. The water soaked her dress and the mud covered her hands, and Elijah stood watching from the woodpile without moving to help. Clara got up, wiped her face, walked back to the spring and filled the buckets again. Did not say a word. From that day on, Elijah stopped calling her Crane's girl. He called her by her name. He showed her how to care for the horses, how to check their hooves for stones and cracks, how to read tracks in the mud, distinguishing elk from mule deer by the shape of the print and the depth of the impression. And he taught her to shoot. Elijah handed her the Homestead Winchester, a well-oiled lever action that had seen years of hard use. He showed her how to seat the stock against her shoulder, firm but not rigid, how to use the front bead and the rear notch together, aligning them on the target, how to breathe. In through the butts, half out through the mouth, hold. Squeeze the trigger with the pad of the finger, not the joint. Squeeze, do not pull. Let the shot surprise you. She missed more than she hit at first. The kick of the rifle startled her, and her shots went high and left. But Elijah was patient in the way that only a man who has trained horses and hunted for survival can be patient. He corrected her stance, adjusted her grip, made her fire 20 rounds at a fence post until her shoulder ached and her ears rang. By the end of the week, she could hit a tin can at 50 yards. Not every time, but often enough. You have steady hands and a good eye, Elijah told her one evening, cleaning the rifle by the fire with the unconscious ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times. Coming from Elijah, that was practically a standing ovation. But it was Silas who occupied Clara's thoughts in the quiet hours. Silas, who barely spoke to her in those first weeks, who acknowledged her presence with nods and grunts, who ate her cooking without comment and maintained a careful physical distance as though proximity itself were dangerous. And yet, Clara noticed things. When she struggled to lift the heavy Dutch oven onto its hook above the fire the next morning, the hook had been lowered by 3 inches. When the cabin door stuck in its frame after a rainstorm, she woke to find it plain, smooth, and rehung. When the step on the porch cracked and under her foot, it was repaired before she went to bed that night. Silas never mentioned these repairs, never drew attention to them. He simply made her world a little easier. One small fix at a time, the way a man tends land he means to keep. He left her share of meat on her plate before serving himself. He banked the fire every night before climbing to the loft. He made sure there was always enough hot water for her morning wash. These were not gestures of romance. They were gestures of care so habitual they had become instinct. Silas cared for Clara the way he cared for his horses, his land, his brothers, as something under his protection, something whose well-being was his responsibility. And Clara noticed the way he looked at her when he thought no one could see. She caught him watching her in the garden one afternoon, his gaze unguarded for just a moment, before the walls slammed back into place. She saw his jaw tighten when her laughter rang through the cabin. Not in displeasure, in something that looked like pain, as though her joy reminded him of something he had lost and did not dare want again. 3 weeks after Clara's arrival, on an evening when the fire burned low and the mountain air carried the first chill hint of approaching autumn, she was standing at the stove stirring venison stew, and she began to hum. It was a melody her mother used to sing, an old song, simple and sweet, about a woman waiting for someone to come home. Clara did not realize she was doing it. The sound came from somewhere deep and unconscious, the way breathing comes, the way heartbeats come. She did not notice the cabin had gone completely silent until she turned around. All 3 brothers were watching her. Gideon with a gentle, almost wistful smile. Elijah with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Soft, unguarded, vulnerable in a way that seemed to surprise even him. And Silas, standing by the window with his back to the room, his massive shoulders rigid, one hand gripping the window frame so hard his knuckles had gone white. "Do not stop," Gideon said quietly. Clara resumed humming, softer now. She watched Silas's reflection in the dark window glass, and she saw something that broke her heart and mended it at the same time. His eyes were closed, and there were tears on his cheeks. Not many, just 1 or 2 quickly wiped away with the back of his hand. But enough. She finished the song. Silas left the cabin without a word. Outside, Clara heard the axe start up. Violent, rhythmic, the sound of a man fighting his own feelings with the only weapon he trusted, physical labor. Gideon caught Clara's eye across the table. "Mary used to sing," he said softly. "Same kind of voice. Gentle. Sweet." Clara's throat tightened. She nodded and turned back to the stew. Nobody spoke of it again, but something had shifted. Some invisible door had cracked open an inch, and through that crack light was beginning to find its way in. A month after Clara's arrival, the first supply delivery came up the mountain. A nervous young miner named Billy Carson led the pack mule to the cabin porch, handed Clara a letter from Patterson, and rode back down the trail as fast as his horse would carry him. He did not make eye contact. He did not linger. The Blackwood reputation was doing its work. Clara opened the letter. As she read, the warmth drained from her face. Patterson wrote with careful, measured words, but the news they carried was poison. Mrs. Hadley had been conducting a systematic campaign against Clara's reputation in Copper Ridge. She had been telling everyone that Clara was living in sin with three men simultaneously, that she was a common woman who had traded her virtue for room and board. Randall Crane, eager to justify his rejection, had been confirming these rumors, adding that Clara had shown her true character when she abandoned propriety to move in with three bachelor brothers. The lies had taken root. Clara Whitfield, the mail-order bride nobody wanted, had become Clara Whitfield, the harlot of Blackwood Mountain. Clara read the letter aloud to the brothers. Gideon's face darkened with anger. Elijah's fist clenched, and he took 2 steps toward the door before Gideon stopped him with a sharp word. Silas said nothing for a long time. He stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, staring into the flames. Then he spoke. "Let them talk. Their words do not reach up here, but they reach her reputation," Gideon argued. "If she ever wants to leave, if she ever wants a normal life, these lies will follow her everywhere. She is not leaving." Silas's voice was flat, final. Then, hearing what he had said, the possessiveness in it, his jaw tightened. "Unless she wants to," Clara looked at him, "I do not want to leave." The air between them shifted, the barest flicker of something unspoken. A door cracking open another inch. 6 weeks after Clara arrived at the cabin, Silas sent her down to Patterson's store with a supply list. Gideon, his leg mostly healed, rode with her. It was Clara's first return to Copper Ridge. The town received her with cold fascination. Women stared from doorways. Men muttered on the boardwalk. Clara kept her chin up and her eyes forward and completed her business at Patterson's store without incident. Patterson pulled her aside to warn her that the rumors had grown worse. Crane was telling people the Blackwood brothers had purchased Clara as a shared wife. Gideon waited with the horses while Clara made a final stop at the dry goods store for thread and fabric. She was inside for only a few minutes. When she stepped back onto the boardwalk, 3 men were waiting. Miners. Part of the crew that worked the copper claim owned by Mrs. Hadley's husband. Rough men, filthy from a day underground, emboldened by whiskey and the knowledge that the woman before them had been declared fair game by the town's social arbiters. Their leader was a gap-toothed man named Jenks. He planted himself in Clara's path like a fence post. "Well, if it is not the Blackwood brothers' woman's," Jenks said loud enough for the street to hear. "Heard you keep all 3 of them happy. Must be tiring work." Clara's blood went cold. The street was empty. Gideon was around the corner with the horses out of earshot. "Get out of my way," she said. "We just want to talk." A second miner moved to flank her, cutting off retreat. "See, the boys and me, we figure if you are generous enough for 3, maybe you could spare some time for a few more. We have got money." I said move. Jenks reached for her arm. His hand closed on the fabric of her sleeve. His eyes were mean and small and enjoying her fear. This was not flirtation. This was predation. "Do not touch her." The voice came from behind the miners, cold and calm and devastating. Gideon stood at the mouth of the alley. Despite his healing leg, despite his gentle nature, there was nothing soft in his expression. He was a Blackwood. The same blood that made Silas silent and Elijah volatile ran in Gideon too, and right now it was boiling. Then a shadow fell over Jenks from behind, and the color drained from his face. Elijah Blackwood had materialized from somewhere. He had been in town picking up horseshoes from the blacksmith. The commotion drew him in the way blood draws wolves. Elijah did not speak, did not warn. He grabbed Jenks by the collar, lifted the man off his feet, 200 pounds of miner rising into the air like a child's doll, and slammed him against the wall of the dry goods store. The impact rattled the window panes. Dust sifted from the eaves. "You put your hands on her." Elijah's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the violence of a thunderclap. His free hand was cocked back in a fist, and every person watching knew that fist could shatter bone. "Eli." Gideon's voice was sharp. "Eli, do not." Elijah's entire body vibrated with the effort of restraint. His whiskey-brown eyes bored into Jenks's terrified face. "If you ever come near her again," Elijah said each word deliberate and measured and terrible, "I will find you. And I will not stop at shoving you against a wall. Nobody touches her. Nobody. Not while I am breathing." He released Jenks. The man collapsed against the wall, his legs barely holding him. The three miners scrambled away down the alley, shooting terrified glances but over their shoulders. When they returned to the cabin and told Silas what happened, his reaction was the most frightening of all. Not because it was explosive, because it was not. Silas went very still. His gaze went flat and lightless. He asked for the miners' names, then he said quietly, I will handle it. He rode down the mountain alone the next morning, returned that evening without a word. The miners never bothered Clara again. The next time she visited Copper Ridge, Jenks crossed the street to avoid her, and his face was wearing a bruise the size of a horseshoe. But the damage was done. The encounter with the miners was a symptom. The disease was Copper Ridge itself and the people who controlled it. In the weeks that followed, the walls between Clara and Silas continued to crumble. Slowly, painfully, like ice melting in spring, one drip at a time. One night by the fire, Silas told Clara about Mary. Not everything, some wounds are too deep for a single telling. But enough. How they met in Montana. How they came to Wyoming together, all four of them, and built this cabin with their own hands. How Mary had loved this meadow, had planted the garden, had talked about filling the cabin with children. How she died, in this cabin on the bed where Clara slept, screaming for help that came too late. How Silas held his son tiny and perfect and lifeless, and felt something inside him break so completely he was not sure it could ever be repaired. Clara listened without tears, without pity, with the steady, unflinching attention of someone who knew grief from the inside. When Silas finished, she said simply, "Thank you for telling me, and for trusting me with her memory." Silas's jaw worked. He nodded once and left. The axe started up outside. But the rhythm was different this time. Slower, less violent, more like breathing. Days later, Clara was washing dishes. Silas came to refill the water bucket. They moved around each other in the small cabin space, and their hands brushed. An accident. Ordinary. Meaningless. Neither pulled away. They stood there, fingers almost touching, and Clara looked up to find Silas's face inches from hers. His eyes were dark with something she recognized. Want and the fear of want locked in a struggle. Neither side was winning. He leaned closer. Clara's eyes began to close. Then Silas pulled back, sharp and sudden, as though her nearness had burned him. He left the cabin without a word. Clara stood alone, her heart hammering, her hands still tingling where his skin had touched hers. She knew now. With absolute certainty, Silas Blackwood felt something for her, and it terrified him more than any mountain lion or blizzard or violent stranger ever could, because the last woman he had allowed himself to feel for had died in his arms. 3 months after Clara's arrival, riders appeared on the mountain trail. 4 men on horseback approached the homestead. Clara, kneeling in the garden, heard the horses first. She stood, shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun, and her stomach dropped. Randall Crane, mounted uncomfortably on a horse too small for his bulk, his expensive suit absurd against the mountain backdrop. Sheriff Hollister, lean and hard-faced, badge catching sunlight, and 2 of Mrs. Hadley's hired men armed and watchful. Silas emerged from the cabin with his rifle before Clara could call out. Elijah appeared from the stable, his own weapon already in hand, moving to flank the visitors with the practiced efficiency of men who had planned for exactly this kind of trouble. Crane, Silas said. His voice could freeze water at 50 paces. "You are on my land." Crane dismounted with the stiffness of a man who had spent 4 miserable hours in a saddle. His face was purple with exertion and self-righteous fury. "I have come for what is mine, Blackwood. Nothing up here belongs to you." "She does." Crane pointed at Clara with a thick, manicured finger. "That woman entered into a contractual agreement with me, a bride contract, legally binding. She was provided transportation at my expense on the understanding she would fulfill her obligations as my bride." Clara felt the earth shift beneath her. "You rejected me, in front of the entire town. You said the arrangement was off." "Witnesses remember things differently," Crane said smoothly. "Mrs. Hadley recalls me offering you accommodation while we discussed terms, which you refused, choosing instead to flee to the mountains and cohabitate with 3 unmarried men." The lie was so complete, so architecturally perfect, that Clara could only stare. "Show me the contract," Gideon called from the porch, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent years with books and knew how to use words like weapons. Show me the document signed by both parties, witnessed and notarized. A mail-order bride arrangement is not a chattel contract. It is an agreement of intent. Miss Whitfield is a free woman. She is not livestock. Crane sputtered. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. One of Hadley's men muttered something about arrangements being arranged, and the barrel of Silas's rifle swung toward him with terrifying speed. The standoff stretched. Crane argued. The sheriff insisted. Clara felt the legal ground crumbling beneath her feet. No money for a lawyer, no family to advocate, no standing in a town that had already written her off. Silas had been silent through all of it, standing like stone with his rifle against his shoulder and his pale eyes flat and distant, calculating. Then he spoke, and everything changed. I will marry her. The words fell into the clearing like boulders dropped from a great height. Every head turned, every voice died. Behind Silas, Elijah's hand tightened on his rifle. Not in surprise, in something closer to pride. Gideon, still on the porch, let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 3 years. I will marry her, Silas repeated. Today. Make it legal, my wife, my name, my protection, permanent and beyond challenge. He turned to Clara, and for the first time since she had known him, his face was completely open. Fear and hope and determination laid bare for everyone to see. Clara Whitfield, will you marry me? Clara's mind spun. This was not a love confession. This was a tactical strike, a legal shield forged in the heat of desperation. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw more than strategy. She saw a man who had been afraid to feel for 3 years, making the most terrifying choice of his life. Yes, she said. Her voice did not waver. I will marry you. They rode to Copper Ridge that afternoon. All 4 of them. The ceremony was brief. Reverend Whitmore asked hard questions and received honest answers. Clara wore her navy traveling dress, the only dress she owned, with her mother's cameo pinned over her heart. Silas wore his cleanest shirt. Gideon and Elijah stood as witnesses, 2 mountains of muscle and fierce loyalty flanking their brother. When the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, Silas hesitated. Then he leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss to Clara's forehead, tender but restrained. The kiss of a man making a promise, not fulfilling a desire. On the church steps, Mrs. Hadley was waiting. Of course she was. How touching, she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The unwanted bride and the mountain hermit. What a perfectly desperate little match. It was Elijah who answered, not Silas, not Clara. Elijah, whose fists spoke louder than his words ever could. My brother Elijah, said, his voice cutting through the gathered crowd like a blade through silk, is the best man in this territory. And Clara is the bravest woman I have ever known. You have insulted both of them for the last time. He turned to face the crowd. Clara is a Blackwood now. She is under our name and our protection. Every one of us. Anyone who causes her harm through words or actions, or the kind of poisonous gossip that passes for entertainment in this place, will answer to all 3 of us. And I promise you that is not a conversation anyone here wants to have. Gideon stepped forward with a smile that carried steel beneath its warmth. What my brother means to say is that we hope you will treat our new sister-in-law with the respect she deserves. We would hate for things to become unpleasant. The Blackwood brothers mounted their horses. Silas helped Clara into her saddle, his hands lingering at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. They rode out of Copper Ridge 4 abreast, a wall of muscle and conviction, and something that looked from a distance very much like family. Behind them, Mrs. Priscilla Hadley stood on the boardwalk with her mouth open, and for the first time in living memory, nothing coming out of it. They rode home in silence. The trail felt shorter somehow. Or maybe Clara's mind was too full to notice the switchbacks and the drop-offs that had terrified her months ago. She was married, legally bound to Silas Blackwood. No longer Clara Whitfield. Clara Blackwood now. The name felt foreign, like clothing that did not quite fit, but clothing she suspected she might grow into given time. At the cabin, Silas dismounted and helped her down. His hands were steady. His face was not. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for putting you in that position, for not finding a better way. You saved me, Clara said simply. Again. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the stable, and Clara watched him go, this enormous, broken, beautiful man who had offered himself as armor to protect a woman he barely knew. Or maybe she thought he knew her better than she realized. Maybe he had been paying attention all along, to the way she worked without complaint, to the song she hummed by the fire, to the steady, stubborn way she refused to break no matter how hard the world pressed down. Maybe Silas Blackwood had been falling too. He just did not have the words for it yet. What neither of them knew standing in that yard, with the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders and the taste of a new name still strange on Clara's tongue, was that the real test was not behind them. It was waiting in the months ahead, in the slow, terrifying work of turning a legal arrangement into something neither of them had dared to hope for. Winter was coming to Blackwood Mountain, and it would bring with it a storm that would either forge them into something unbreakable or shatter them completely. The cabin felt different after the wedding. The same four walls, the same stone fireplace, the same view of the meadow through the same window glass. But something in the air had changed. As though the building itself understood that the people inside it had rearranged themselves into a new formation, and the walls were still deciding what to make of it. Silas handled the practicalities first. That was his way. Emotion could wait. Logistics could not. Clara would keep the sleeping alcove. The brothers had already built a proper wall and door during her first weeks at the cabin, giving her real privacy. Silas moved his bedroll to the loft above the main room. A temporary arrangement, he said. And the way he said it made clear he intended it to stay temporary for as long as Clara needed it to. "You are my wife," he said on their first night back from Copper Ridge. He stood in the middle of the cabin, this enormous man filling the space the way a boulder fills a creek bed, looking more uncertain than Clara had ever seen him. "That means something to me. But it does not mean I expect anything. You married me for protection. I offered it freely. Whatever this marriage becomes will be because you want it, not because you feel obligated." "And what do you want?" Clara asked. The question hit him like a physical blow. She could see it land, could see his jaw clench and his hands ball into fists at his sides and the muscles in his neck cord with the effort of keeping something enormous locked behind his teeth. "What I want does not matter," he said slowly. "What matters is what is right. What if what you want and what is right are the same thing?" Silas looked at her then. Really looked. And Clara saw it. The hunger, not physical, not carnal, something deeper and more devastating than either. The soul-deep hunger of a man who had been alone for 3 years and had forgotten how to reach for another person. Who wanted to reach? Who was terrified of reaching? Because the last time he reached for someone, she died. "Then I would say we are both luckier than we deserve," he murmured. And he climbed to the loft and Clara went to her alcove, and neither of them slept well that night. December came to Blackwood Mountain the way a fist comes to a jaw, fast and brutal and without warning. Clara woke one morning to a world gone white and howling. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. Snow fell so thick and fast that the barn disappeared behind a wall of white when she looked through the window. Wind screamed through the pines, tearing branches loose, rattling the cabin walls, finding every crack and gap in the chinking and driving needles of cold air into the room. Silas and Elijah were already outside, moving through the storm, with the grim efficiency of men who understood that hesitation in weather like this meant dead livestock and maybe dead people. They drove the cattle into the barn, hauled extra firewood to the cabin porch, reinforced the stable doors with crossbeams. Clara could not help with the outside work. She had never seen weather like this, never felt cold that bit through clothing and skin and muscle all the way to the bone. Gideon stayed with her inside, keeping the fire roaring, his face tight with worry as the wind found new ways to assault the cabin. On the second day, the accumulated weight of snow collapsed one wall of the stable. The horses panicked. Elijah was inside trying to calm them when the big roan gelding kicked out in blind terror. The hoof caught Elijah across the ribs, a glancing blow but enough to send him staggering backward into a drift. Silas found him there gasping, clutching his side, unable to stand. He dragged his brother back to the cabin. Gideon consulted the medical texts he had ordered from Denver months earlier and diagnosed cracked ribs. He wrapped them tightly with strips of cloth, his gentle hands working with surprising precision. Elijah tried to stand. "I do not rest," he growled through clenched teeth. "You rest or you puncture a lung, and then you are dead, and then there are 2 brothers in a collapsed stable in the middle of a blizzard," Gideon said. And for the first time since Clara had known him, there was iron in his voice. The quiet brother, the gentle one. the peacemaker, speaking with an authority that came from somewhere deep and unexpected. Lie down. Elijah lay down. It may have been the first time in his life he followed an order from his younger brother. The next 3 days tested everything the Blackwood family had. Silas worked alone in the killing cold, rebuilding the stable wall with salvaged logs and canvas, tending the animals, breaking ice on the spring with an axe so thick it took 20 blows to crack through. His beard froze, his hands cracked and bled. He came inside only to eat and warm himself enough to go back out. Clara tended the fire and cooked, the mundane, essential, life-sustaining work that kept everyone alive. She rationed their supplies with the precision of a pharmacist. So much flour for each loaf, so many beans for each pot of stew, so much salted meat for each day. She patched the cabin walls where wind whistled through gaps in the chinking stuffing rags and moss into every crack she could find. She kept the coffee hot. She kept the fire burning. She kept her voice calm and her hands steady, even when the wind screamed outside like something alive and hungry. Gideon managed everything else, tracking supplies, monitoring Elijah's breathing for the wet rattle that would mean a punctured lung, keeping watch for the subtle signs of frostbite and hypothermia that could steal a life before anyone noticed. And Clara discovered something about herself during those 3 terrible days. Something she had not known. Something nobody had ever told her because nobody had ever given her the chance to prove it. She was not fragile. She was the center of this household. The gravity that held these 3 brothers in orbit. Without her cooking, they did not eat. Without her fire, they froze. Without her calm, steady presence holding the domestic machinery together, the fear and exhaustion would have shattered their coordination. She was not a burden. She was the foundation. On the 4th morning, the blizzard broke. Clara stepped onto the porch and into a world buried under 4 feet of snow, brilliant and silent and utterly clean. The sky was blue from horizon to horizon. The mountains stood white and gleaming against it like the bones of the earth laid bare. The air was so cold it burned her lungs, and so pure it made her want to cry. Silas came inside, ice in his beard, his hands nearly blue. He could barely close his fingers around the coffee cup Clara pressed into them. She wrapped his hands in warm cloths and held them against her own body until feeling returned, and he let her, and neither of them spoke about what that meant. "You kept us alive," Silas said quietly. "We kept each other alive," Clara said. "That is what family does." It was the first time anyone had called the 4 of them a family out loud. The word hung in the cabin air like something holy. Even Elijah, lying on his pallet with his ribs wrapped tight, heard it and did not argue. "Winter always ends," Clara said. Silas looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes held no walls. "Always," he said. From the pallet across the room, Elijah's voice came rough with pain and something that might have been amusement. "If you 2 are going to stand there staring at each other all morning, somebody might consider making breakfast. Some of us got kicked by a horse and would appreciate a meal that was not cooked by Gideon." Gideon looked up from his medical text with exaggerated offense. "My cooking kept you alive for 4 days. "Barely," Elijah said. "There were moments I was not sure the stew was not trying to finish what the horse started." Clara laughed. It was the first real laugh any of them had shared in days, and it rang through the cabin like a bell chasing the last shadows of the storm from the corners of the room. Even Silas's mouth twitched. That ghost of a smile that Clara was learning to read like weather signs on the mountain. Faint but unmistakable, and full of promise. January of 1879. 3 months married. A few weeks past the blizzard that had nearly killed them and had instead forged them into something unbreakable. Clara was sitting on the porch steps watching the sunset paint the mountains amber and crimson when the tears came. Not dramatic sobs, quiet tears. The kind that come when grief keeps its own schedule, and the weight of everything you have survived catches up with you all at once. She missed her mother. She missed having someone who loved her without conditions or qualifications or the need to earn it. She missed the feeling of belonging somewhere, truly belonging, without having to fight for it every single day. Silas found her there. He sat down beside her on the cold wooden step, not touching, just present, and he waited without speaking, which was its own kind of gift. "I am sorry," Clara said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I should be happy. I am happy. But sometimes I just..." Miss having people who loved you, Silas finished quietly. Miss your mother. Miss feeling like you belong somewhere without having to fight for it. Clara stared at him. He had put words to the exact shape of her grief, feelings she had not spoken aloud to anyone. Mary used to cry like this sometimes, Silas said. And the fact that he could say her name without his voice breaking told Clara something important about his healing. Not because she was unhappy with me, because grief has its own schedule, because healing is not a straight line, because sometimes the weight of everything you have survived just catches up with you. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and he took her hand. You do not have to apologize for feeling, he said. Not to me, not ever. Clara's fingers tightened around his. They sat like that until the stars came out hand in hand on the porch steps, watching the sky darken over the mountains they had survived together. When Clara stood to go inside, Silas followed. Still holding her hand, at the door he stopped, and he said something that she would remember for the rest of her life, each word slow and careful as though it cost him something precious to let it go. I think I might be falling in love with you. Not the way I loved Mary. That was different. Born of youth and a different kind of innocence. This is something that grew from watching you, from respecting who you are, from wanting to wake up every morning knowing you are the person I share this life with. Clara reached up and held his face in both hands, felt the rasp of his beard against her palms, saw the uncertainty in his gaze, the fear that he had said too much, revealed too much, made himself too vulnerable. I have been falling in love with you since the day you told me Crane was a fool, she said. Maybe even before that, when you looked at me and saw courage instead of failure. Claire, he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. Their first real kiss happened right there in the doorway, not the gentle press of lips to forehead from the wedding ceremony. A real kiss, deep and honest and full of everything they had both been too afraid to name. Clara's arms went around his neck, and Silas pulled her close, and the mountain air was cold on their skin, and neither of them cared. When they finally drew apart, both breathing hard, Silas rested his forehead against hers and closed his eyes. I was so afraid, he admitted. Me too, Clara whispered. But I would rather be afraid with you than safe without you. That night, everything changed between them. The door to Clara's alcove closed softly behind them both. When morning came, Silas was beside her, and the distance between them had vanished permanently. They had chosen each other, not out of desperation or duty or legal necessity, out of want, out of love, out of the quiet, fierce courage it takes to build something new on the ground where something precious was lost. Gideon and Elijah said nothing about the new arrangement, but Gideon smiled more, and even Elijah's perpetual scowl softened into something approaching contentment. The cabin felt different now, warmer, more complete, not just a shelter against the mountain's indifference, a home. Early March of 1879. Clara stood in the empty garden behind the cabin, one hand pressed against her stomach. Her monthly time was 3 weeks late. She waited another week to be certain. Then she told Silas. She was standing by the woodpile when he returned from checking the trap lines. He took one look at her face and dropped the rabbits he was carrying and crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. What is wrong? Nothing is wrong, Clara's voice trembled. At least I do not think anything is wrong. Silas, I think I might be carrying a child. The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. The color drained from his face. His eyes went hollow with a terror so deep it had no bottom. Clara could see the memories crashing over him like floodwater. Mary screaming, the midwife arriving too late, the tiny, perfect, lifeless body of his son, the grave he dug in frozen ground, the 3 years of silence and grief that followed. Silas, Clara gripped his arms. Look at me. I am not Mary. What happened to her will not necessarily happen to me. You do not know that. His voice was raw, wrecked. The voice of a man watching his worst nightmare assemble itself in front of him for the second time. Women die in childbirth out here. Babies die. Especially without proper medical care. Especially without... Then we will make sure I have proper care. Clara's voice was steady, firm, the voice that had talked her through a mountain trail and a blizzard in a town full of cruelty. We will go to Copper Ridge when the time comes. We will have Dr. Collins. We will do whatever it takes. Silas sank to his knees in the garden dirt. He pressed his face against Clara's stomach, his arms wrapping around her hips, and he held her as though she were the last solid thing in a world that was coming apart. "Do not leave me," he whispered. "Either of you. Please do not leave me." Clara's hands found his hair. Her own tears fell freely now. "We will not. I promise you, Silas. We will not." Each brother handled the news in his own way. Gideon wrote to doctors across the territory, ordered medical texts, drafted a birth plan, so detailed it could have served as a military strategy document. Elijah built the cradle. His hands were steadier than Silas's, and he shaped the pine with a tenderness nobody would have believed possible from a man who could put another man through a wall. He smoothed the wood until it gleamed like silk. And one morning, a small wooden horse carved from aspen appeared on the kitchen table, crude but charming. Elijah said nothing about it. He did not need to. And slowly, inch by inch, day by day, Silas let himself feel joy alongside the terror. He began talking to Clara's belly at night, telling their child stories about the mountain, about the elk that grazed in the meadow at dawn, about the hawks that rode the thermals above the peaks, about the life that was waiting for them. "Winter always ends," Clara told him on a night when the fear was bad, "and spring always comes. You have to trust that. You have to trust us." Silas placed his hand on her swelling stomach and felt their daughter kick against his palm, strong and impatient, already fighting to be born. And something in his face changed. The fear did not disappear, but it made room. Just enough room for hope to breathe. Late October of 1879. Clara was 9 months along. The decision had been made weeks earlier. They would go to Copper Ridge for the birth. They arrived in town on a cold, clear morning. All four of them because Elijah and Gideon refused to be left behind. "She is family," Elijah said when Silas suggested they stay to watch the homestead. It was the longest sentence Elijah had spoken all week, and it ended the discussion. Patterson gave them his best room. Refused payment with visible offense. "She is family," he said, unconsciously echoing Elijah. "And after what she did for this town, speaking up against Hadley, showing other women what courage looks like, we owe your wife a debt." The town's transformation startled Clara. Women who had scorned her brought baby clothes and jars of preserves and knitted blankets. Mrs. Hadley had moved back east after her husband lost the copper mine. Crane had left town quietly, his reputation destroyed. Lenora Hollis, a young widow who had suffered under Mrs. Hadley's cruelty for years, visited Clara daily. She had found her voice in the months since Clara's departure, had helped organize other women to push back against the social order that had oppressed them all. "I wanted to apologize," Lenora said one afternoon, her eyes bright with sincerity, "for not speaking sooner, for watching what happened to you and saying nothing." Clara accepted the apology with grace. Forgiveness, she was learning, was not a gift you gave to the person who wronged you. It was a weight you set down so you could walk forward without carrying it. The labor began on a November evening when the first snow of the season fell softly past the windows and the sky turned the color of hammered iron. 20 hours. 20 hours of relentless grinding work that tested everything Clara had. There were moments when the pain was so overwhelming she lost track of time and place. She called for her mother once. The word escaped before she could stop it. "Mama." And Lenora Hollis held her hand through the contraction and did not let go. Outside the room, Silas paced. His boots wore a path in Patterson's wooden floor. His breathing was ragged. His eyes were wild with a terror that reached back 3 years to the worst night of his life. He could hear Clara through the door, and every sound she made was an echo of Mary's screams, and he was drowning in it. Elijah sat beside him, immovable, his hand on Silas's shoulder like an anchor driven into bedrock. "She is strong, Silas. Strongest person any of us have ever known. She survived Crane, survived Hadley, survived that mountain trail alone. She will survive this." He said it over and over, a litany of faith, and Silas clung to the words because they were all he had. Gideon moved between the room and the hallway, carrying updates from Dr. Collins. "Everything is progressing normally. The doctor says she is doing remarkably well. It will not be much longer now." His voice was calm. His hands shook when he thought nobody was looking. Then as the first gray light of dawn seeped through the windows and the snow fell in gentle curtains, past the glass, a different cry split the air. high and thin and furious and perfect. The sound of a newborn announcing her arrival to the world with all the indignation of someone who had been perfectly comfortable and did not appreciate the disruption. Dr. Collins opened the door, smiling. Congratulations, Mr. Blackwood. You have a healthy baby girl, and your wife is doing beautifully. Silas's knees buckled. Elijah caught him, held his massive brother upright with nothing but strength and will. Gideon pressed his forehead against the wall, shoulders shaking, making a sound that was half laughter and half something too big for laughter. Clara lay in the bed, exhausted and radiant, her honey blonde hair dark with sweat against the pillow. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was the smallest, most perfect creature Silas had ever seen. "Come meet your daughter," Clara said. Silas crossed the room slowly, as though moving through deep water. When he reached the bed and looked down at the tiny face, the dark eyes blinking open, the miniature hand curling into a fist no bigger than a walnut, something inside him broke, not breaking apart, breaking free. All the grief and guilt and fear, the 3 years of silence and self-punishment, they did not disappear. But they shifted, made room for something bigger. "She is perfect," he whispered. "What should we name her?" Hope Silas said. "Because she is everything I thought I had lost. Everything I did not dare believe I could have again." Elijah reached out one massive calloused finger, and baby Hope wrapped her tiny hand around it and held on. He made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. "She has got a grip," he said hoarsely. "She is a Blackwood, all right." Gideon held the baby with the careful reverence of a man holding something infinitely precious. He looked at Clara with shining eyes. "She gave us a family," he said simply. "Not just a baby, a family. We had brothers before. Now we have everything." A month later, they brought Hope home to the mountain. Before Clara went inside the cabin, she did something she had been thinking about for weeks. She carried Hope around to the back of the cabin, to the small clearing behind the woodpile where two simple wooden crosses stood beneath a pine tree, sheltered from the worst of the wind and weather. Mary Elizabeth Blackwood, beloved wife, 1845 to 1875. Jacob Silas Blackwood, never held but always loved. Clara knelt in the damp spring earth. She laid wild flowers at the base of the crosses. Purple and white crocuses, the first of the season, gathered from the meadow on the ride in. "I never knew you," she whispered to Mary, "but I know what you meant to him. I know the love you shared, and I know he carries it still. Not as a burden, as a part of who he is. I want you to know I am not trying to replace you. Nobody could, but I am trying to give him the things you would have wanted for him. Happiness, family, a reason to keep going." She adjusted Hope in her arms. The baby stirred, her dark eyes blinking open. "This is Hope," Clara said to the graves. "Your husband's daughter. She has his eyes. I think she will have his stubbornness too." She did not hear Silas approach. He moved so quietly. Always had. She did not know he was there until his shadow fell across the crosses. "I come here sometimes," he said. "Talk to her. Tell her about the day, about the weather. I never told you because I thought you might be hurt, be jealous." Something like that. Clara stood, held Hope with one arm, took Silas's hand with the other. "She was your wife," Clara said, "the mother of your son. Loving her memory does not diminish what we have. It makes it richer. She is part of your story, and your story is part of mine now." Silas looked from Clara to the graves to baby Hope, and the last shadow of guilt dissolved from his face like morning mist burning off under mountain sun. "Thank you," he said, "for understanding, for being you." They stood together before the graves for a long moment, the mountain quiet around them except for birdsong and the distant rush of snowmelt in the creek. Then they walked back to the cabin together, and Silas closed the door behind them, and the past was laid to rest with grace. The years that followed built themselves one season at a time, the way a river builds a canyon. Slowly, inevitably, with a patience that only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see the whole. Their first spring, Clara planted a garden that grew so well, Silas said the soil must have been waiting for someone who knew how to ask it properly. He dug an irrigation channel from the creek, lining it with flat stones so the water ran steady and true. When the first tomato blossom opened, Clara called Silas over to see it. He stood looking at the small yellow flower on the green vine, then at Clara, then at baby Hope sleeping in her cradle at the garden's edge. Beautiful, he said. All three. It was perhaps the most romantic thing Silas Blackwood ever said. Clara kept it in her heart for 30 years. Their second autumn, Clara learned to tan hides, scraping fat with a curved blade, soaking skins in tannin solution made from crushed oak bark, stretching the leather on wooden frames, working it with rendered brain oil until it went soft as cloth. Hard work, heavy work, work that smelled terrible and made her arms ache for days. She never complained. She made Hope's first winter coat from deer hide. She had tanned herself, and when Elijah saw it, he nodded once, which from Elijah was everything. Their third year, the brothers expanded the cabin. Gideon drew the plans. Silas and Elijah felled the timber with double-bit axes, and cross-cut saws dragged the logs by horse-shaped mortise and tenon joints that locked together without a single nail, a technique their father had taught them in Montana. 4 new rooms, space enough for a growing family. Clara carried their second child that year, a boy. When Silas held his son for the first time, the midwife said he wept. Not tears of grief like the ones he had shed years before at Mary's grave. Tears of completion. They named the boy Jacob, after the brother who never drew breath but was always loved. Their 5th year brought the hardest winter any of them had lived through. 3 weeks of continuous snow, 6 cattle lost, supplies running dangerously low. Clara rationed every meal with the precision of a surgeon. So much flour, so many beans, so much hope. They survived on willpower and Clara's steady hand on the household tiller. When the snow finally melted, she stood on the porch with the sun warm on her face. Winter always ends, she said. Silas stood beside her, his eyes soft with a love that had long since stopped being new, but had never stopped being real. Always, he said. Their 7th year, Elijah married Lenora Hollis. The wedding was held in the meadow in front of the cabin, with Reverend Whitmore riding up the mountain to officiate. Elijah, the most volatile man in Wyoming territory, trembled when he spoke his vows. Lenora laughed and steadied his hands with her own. They built a cabin half a mile from the main house, close enough to see each other's chimney smoke, far enough for privacy. Gideon wrote a book, A History of the Wyoming Frontier, documenting native customs, survival techniques, the stories of the men and women who carved lives from wilderness. Published in Denver. It sold a few hundred copies, not enough to make him rich, enough to make him proud. He never married, but he was never alone. Every Blackwood child called him Uncle Gideon, and his book-lined loft was the most popular room on the mountain. Their 12th year, Patterson died. The whole town came to the funeral. Clara placed flowers on his grave and whispered, "Thank you for believing in me." His son took over the store. Their 15th year, Hope was 15, tall and strong and fearless, riding the mountain trail alone, the way her mother had done all those years ago. Silas watched from the porch with silver beginning to show at his temples and pride and terror warring behind those watchful eyes. Jacob was 12, silent and deep like his father, with his mother's cornflower blue eyes. 2 more children had come. Another girl, another boy. The cabin rang with laughter and argument and the sounds of a family too big and too alive to be contained by any walls. But Clara did not know any of this yet. On that first day, climbing down from the stagecoach in Copper Ridge with dust in her hair and $4 in her pocket and nothing in the world except a carpet bag and a cameo brooch, and the stubborn refusal to give up, she could not have imagined the life that was waiting for her on that mountain. Nobody could have. 30 years later, a September afternoon, golden light slanting through the Blackwood Peaks the way it does in early autumn, when the aspens are just beginning to turn and the air carries the first faint promise of frost. On the porch of the cabin, the original porch rebuilt and expanded, but still anchored by the same logs Silas and his brothers had placed 30 years before Clara Blackwood sat in the rocking chair her husband had built when she was carrying Hope. Her hair was silver now, threaded through with the last traces of honey blonde. Her cornflower blue eyes were still bright, still sharp, but they carried the depth that only comes from decades of living fully. At her throat, pinned to the collar of her dress, sat a small cameo brooch, worn smooth by 30 years of fingers touching it for comfort. But still there, always there, beside her Silas. His hair had gone completely white. His face had deepened with lines that mapped every joy and sorrow of 3 decades. His hands, massive and scarred and calloused from a lifetime of building, rested on the arms of his chair. He was slower now. His back ached when the weather turned cold, but he still rose before dawn, still checked the homestead, still split wood, though Hope had taken to hiding the axe because she worried he would overdo it. His amber eyes were the same. That had not changed, would never change. In the yard below, grandchildren chased each other through wildflowers that Claire had planted years ago and that now grew wild across the meadow. Their laughter was sharp and bright in the mountain air, the sound of futures being built on the foundation of a past that had been earned with blood and sweat and stubborn, relentless love. Hope was there, 30 years old now, tall and capable, married to a rancher's son from the valley. She was setting a long table for the family dinner that happened every Sunday without fail, rain or snow or any force in nature strong enough to keep the Blackwoods from gathering. Jacob managed most of the ranch, now moving through the property with his father's quiet authority and his mother's steady hands. The younger children helped where they could. Elijah leaned against the porch rail, his auburn hair shot through with iron gray, still watchful, still vigilant. 30 years had not changed his fundamental nature. He was still the first to sense trouble and the last to stand down. Lenora sat beside him, knitting something small and soft for their newest grandchild. Gideon sat in his favorite corner with a book. There was always a book, but his eyes were not on the page. He was watching his family, counting blessings that none of them had dared to imagine 30 years ago. "Do you remember, Clara?" asked Silas quietly. "The day I arrived, I knocked on that door, shaking, covered in trail dust, half-starved." Silas reached over and took her hand, the same hand he had first held on a porch step on a January evening when she was crying, and he did not know what to say except the truth. "I remember," he said. "I remember thinking Crane is a fool." Clara laughed. The sound was bright and free and exactly the same as it had been 30 years ago, but deeper now, richer. Filled with 3 decades of mornings and evenings and blizzards survived and children born and gardens planted and a love that had started as a legal arrangement and grown into something that could not be contained by any word as small as love. "You were right," she said. "You were right about everything." "Not everything," Silas said. His voice was low and warm and certain. "I was wrong when I thought I could never love again. Wrong when I thought the pain would never make room for anything else." He looked out at the yard where his grandchildren played. "You taught me that, you and the children. And my brothers." He squeezed her hand. "Built this with our own hands," he said quietly. "Every bit of it." Clara looked out over the homestead they had carved from wilderness. The cabin that had grown into a home. The barn and the stable and the corrals. The garden that fed 3 households now. The mountain that had tested them and sheltered them and watched over them with its ancient patient indifference. She remembered stepping off the stagecoach into nothing. A dusty street. A cruel man in an expensive suit. A town that did not want her. $4 in a carpet bag and a cameo brooch, and not a single person on the face of the earth who cared whether she lived or died. 30 years later, sitting on the porch he had built with his own hands, watching their grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers, she thought the words that had been waiting inside her all along. "That was the day my life began." The unwanted bride had found where she belonged, not in a town that judged and discarded her. On a mountain with 3 brothers who saw her worth when the world saw nothing. She had come to Wyoming carrying nothing but a carpet bag and fading hope. She had found love and family and a home where she was wanted and valued and cherished beyond measure. And in finding it, she had discovered the truth that had been waiting for her from the very beginning. She was enough. She had always been enough, and she always would be. Clara Blackwood closed her eyes, her husband's hand warm in hers, her grandchildren's laughter ringing across the meadow. The mountain standing eternal against the sky so blue, it made her heart ache with the beauty of being alive. She was home, and she would never be unwanted again.